Thank you very much. You know, with these webinars and Zoom meetings and team meetings is quite a new phenomenon, and I'm not quite used to presenting yet. Apparently, two of the most successful professions since the lockdown have been plastic surgeons and orthodontists. It's really intimidating to be in a camera and not being able to see anyone else. I was so nervous, I even put on my trousers and polished my shoes because I've seen so many examples of guys getting caught out with what happens in the background. Okay, so anyway, as Bosman says, I'm the product manager for the Lexis Assure solution, and I've been with LexisNexis about 5 years. But I think it's quite strange I find myself into the compliance industry. You know the story about the cobbler's son, the one with no shoes. Well, I think Arto kind of put me forward to this role because my level of compliance there must be a little bit less than exemplary. I spent my high school years in boarding school. With the new norm, with Teams and the video technology, maybe you can't see exactly how old I am, thank God. But I'm sure you can gather that in those days, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have duvets on our beds as boarders. We didn't have curtains in the dorm rooms on the windows. And I can actually make a bed using sheets and blankets, believe it or not. One thing we all remember from boarding school is that for the first month, we were only allowed to contact our parents by mail. It was still the time of corporal punishment and strict school regimes, where teachers' crazy discipline ideas were carried out by over-enthusiastic prefects. I bring on Spud. The reason why I mention this is that during the first 2 weeks at school, obviously for your first year only, we were spoiled by a period of grace, a period during which you were exempt from punishment for contravention of the laws and rules. Essentially, you had immunity. Right, mark on, there we go. And wait for this one. Ignorantia juris neminen excusat. The key principle at school was you can't be expected to know what's required of you from the day you arrive, especially since many of the rules had no sound reasoning behind them. I mean, hands in the pockets. Why should some be allowed to put one hand in their pocket, others 2 hands, and others none at all? Some were just rules for the sake of rules, and I'm sure others were put in there just simply to catch you out. But in real life, it's not so simple. Ignorance is no defense. Ignorantia juris neminen excusat. I can't tell you how many times I practiced that, and I think I still got it wrong. This is the legal principle where a person who is unaware of the law may not escape liability for violating the law merely for being unaware of its content. I think we all know that concept. However, that said, it doesn't mean here in South Africa it's not used as a defense. Over the past few years, we've had our fair share of public legal battles and events. It all started with Oscar's trial when our productivity plummeted. We then had Zuma and all his troubles that are still ongoing. And more recently, Justice Zondo has kept us entertained with his commission. There have been many instances where ignorance of the law has been put forward as an explanation or contravention. The former CEO of Denel Land Systems, Stefan Berger, stated, and I quote, "At the time, I was not aware it was a breach of any law. I was aware it was a breach of the Denel procurement policy," end quote. He was the CEO of a large public entity, and he was not aware of the procurement legislation that applied to him and his organization. Also, Swani, then at one point MEC of Human Settlements in the Free State, his testimony and defense at the Zondo Commission regarding the housing issue is based on ignorance of the law and government tender processes, probably some of the most important legislation relevant to his role in the human settlements. I quote, "I was an MSc who followed the prescripts of the law as much as I could understand them. I could not read this law," referring to the Housing Act, "because I did not know about it." There's also more general ignorance. Another former ESCOM chairperson, Zola Sotsi, admitted to poor oversight and ignorance by the board, himself in particular, in efforts to terminate the contract of coal supply. He admitted he could have done better to ensure the contract was terminated, but claimed to have misunderstood the term holden abeyance used by Madonsela. Former chairperson Ben Ngubani also claimed ignorance about irregularities at Eskom when he testified before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. And then just this week, Northwest Premier Sweni Sipani says she was not aware her mask fell off when she stepped out of her vehicle while at Jackson Mthembu's funeral. The irony that Mr. Mthembu died from COVID should not escape us. The other popular defense in SA is, I can't remember, or I don't know. Weren't these tactics that we used when we were kids? They certainly didn't fly in the prefect's room after dinner, but in a formal court, the challenge is a little bit different. There are situations when the required level of knowledge of rules and regulations are not at hand to those that need to know. There are understandable situations where this is the case, but ignorance is still no defense. So in the context of compliance, why is there ignorance? Why is it that those at the highest level of office in public organizations or public office are not aware of their obligations and responsibilities? Well, no one just has all that knowledge, maybe 2 or 3 people in a large organization. It's knowledge that is acquired over time, extensive study and experience, and a committed approach to keeping your knowledge up to date. For instance, partaking in webinars. These are scarce skills, and it does not help that there's no formal tertiary education options here. Just look in the marketplace and see how in demand experienced financial service compliance officers are. So what is preventing the knowledge reaching those that need to know? Well, the first issue is that you need to know what you don't know. The axiom, I don't know what I don't know. So to get this information, you need to consult with those that do know. Either task your in-house compliance officer or legal officer to do the research, or source from a service provider, such as a law firm or specialist compliance service provider. There are various places you can get free regulatory registers, such as industry bodies. But be careful, they are obviously not liable for any omissions. The final onus will remain with you, and you may still be left with the scenario that you don't know what you don't know. This raises the issue of cost. Most regulatory universes of just primary and secondary legislation come to over 50 pieces of legislation. Developing this legislation requires a deep understanding of each piece of legislation. Hence, those that know are not going to just give it away. And remember, your universe is not just a list of acts, it's specific sections of those acts and regulations, the real detail and the directives. It's an incredible amount of material to get through. Then, of course, there's the challenge of understanding these requirements. Sure, the compliance officer, the financial director may be able to understand the requirements based on the verbatim provided by our government, but the personnel required to implement these measures to ensure compliance probably don't have this knowledge, cannot understand the legalese, and don't have time to really get through it. You need a mechanism to document the requirements in a format management and not just executives can understand. Something at LexisNexis we refer to as the business language. What about the consequence? It is simply not feasible to monitor the compliance requirements of all the acts in your universe. The burden is just too great. So how do we get to manage what we need to manage? And we have to adopt a risk-based approach. We'll focus on those that have the highest risk. But to do this, we need to understand the consequence of non-compliance. It is not only the risk, it's not the only risk, but it's certainly a key one to consider. No one wants a 10 million rand fine, or worse, a license revoked. And then, of course, all this changes on a weekly basis. So I'm wondering how you guys have all got time to join this webinar. But let's get back to consequence. What are the consequences? What are the chances of an adverse finding from a regulator? Are the regulators really doing their jobs? And if they are making adverse findings, what are their sanctions? What are the consequences? What do they enforce on you? We can read the regulations where fines and penalties may be documented, but that's not necessarily how it happens. We need to understand the precedents that have been set. Because if you're not held to account, why comply? It's the foundation of the risk-based approach. If there are no consequences, the priority surely is low. Regulators in South Africa are generally seen as being ineffective, especially when representing consumer rights. Remember, policy and enforcing regulations is just one of the responsibilities of a regulator. Far better use of their resources to proactively prevent non-compliance, be it by education, guidance, or any other mechanism. An opinion piece on the University of Witwatersrand's webpage starts, I quote, "South Africa's independent regulators have failed. Instead of introducing new ones, alternatives need to be found," end quote. Later they continue, "An important example is how the energy regulator failed to ensure a stable pricing path for electricity. This is the most basic function, and in trying to perform its function, it has now hindered the resolution of the crisis at the state-owned power utility Eskom by awarding tariffs that offset the support from the Treasury at a time when the country faces serious fiscal and energy threats." When it comes, end quote, when it comes to policing regulations, the level of activity is vastly different across different regulators, industries, and functions. Understandably, regulations that affect people are more readily and vigorously monitored. Think of the labor regulations, Employee Health and Safety Act, Basic Conditions of Employment, occupational injuries. I've heard that South African legislation is some of the most progressive in the protection of the individual's right. With regard to employment legislation, obviously the voice of the unions has been a huge influence here. The mining industry historically had terrible labor practices and very poor safety measures and environmental control. The abuse of the environment was also evident. Improved legislation, however, and the tighter monitoring, again at the assistance of unions, addressed these issues. But meeting these standards was so costly, many mines became unprofitable, but rightly so. Their practices were just not right. Then there's legislation that protects the consumer, especially in terms of finance. Competition Commission is very active, as are the ombudsmen for the financial service providers and the short-term insurance. ICASA, the Complaints Commission. Yes, directly global compliance requirements regarding who you can and can't trade with ultimately prevents funds finding their way to wayward organizations, funding terrorism, or worse in my mind, social travesties such as human trafficking and sex slaves. Legislation protecting shareholders, however, appears not to have the bite required. Too often we see examples of massive corporate fraud go unpunished. Not unpublished for sure, very well published. Marcus Jooste of Steinhoff is our current favorite villain, but there have been others that have got away scot-free. There's already a book entitled The Stellenbosch Mafia, and I guess it's only a matter of time before we learn more about that environment. Then there's the case of erratic sanction to transgression. On Sunday, our Mpumalanga Premier, Rafielwe, who was recorded as not wearing a mask in public, after initially providing a multitude of excuses, she eventually went to a police station and paid an admission of guilt fine. But in the last 4 weeks, of the 7,000 people arrested for contravening regulations of the level 3 lockdown, 4,000 were for not wearing masks. I wonder if they were given the same opportunity. Having said that, I'm sure there were several that paid a on-the-spot admission of guilt fine. What about the formula dad, the gent who broke the curfew to procure baby formula as his wife was not providing adequate milk for their child? The baby was just 2 weeks old, and despite seeing the formula, the receipt, and the baby, he was still taken into custody. There's no doubt that the law is applied inconsistently the world over, since people are involved, and they each have their own bias. So we must build a risk framework that cater for these variances. Earlier this year, in a response to an EFF question regarding compliance of water use licenses, Minister of Human Settlements, Lindiwe Sisulu, said that of the 476 mines her department had audited since 2015, 155 scored below 50%. Sisulu said that said that since April 2015, her department had issued 226 administrative actions against mines found to have contravened the National Water Act, and 9 criminal cases had been opened against non-compliant mines. But, I quote, to date, no water use entitlements have been suspended or revoked due to non-compliance. However, this remains an option in the case the administrative, civil, and criminal processes do not achieve the desired compliance, end quote. In my mind, water pollution is a serious issue. I think these regulations are not being enforced sufficiently. On the same issue in 2019, the Center for Environmental Rights, very interesting organization, you should pop onto their website and see what they do. They published a report that found that the department had failed to monitor compliance with the water use licenses of 8 coal mining operations in Mpumalanga, and quote, to take enforcement action where violations are obvious, painting a picture of a broken national department unable to fill statutory mandate of water resource protection, end quote. Of course, there are many instances where fines and other penalties have been administered successfully. But there's fair argument to say that sanctions are often lenient and non-existent. Unfortunately, the risk doesn't end there. Even if regulators and others with legal routes to hold organizations to account are not active, there's still the phenomenon of the public voicing their opinion. Do you recall the scenario of the young entrepreneur in Cape Town who developed an innovative baby carrier that was then copied by Woolworths? Woolworths actually purchased one of the carriers and had it delivered so they could copy it almost exactly so they need not go through an entire development cycle. While legal action on behalf of the entrepreneur may well have not resulted in success, given the strengths of Woolworths' legal team versus a one-person business, this was not an option for Woolworths, given the public outcry. The public aren't concerned with the intricacies of the law and the various loopholes and exemptions, but they judge by what they think is ethical, what they think is correct. So in addition to all the rules and regulations, you've got to be aware that you'll also be judged by the public. And that's why Mervyn King and his code is your friend. King speaks to overall governance and output-based compliance. Ticking the box can only get you so far. Again, all that I've said, the burden of compliance is substantial. It's important to engage with service providers who can help you on your journey. So let's recap. Ignorance is not a defense, and it is difficult to know everything you need to know. So get help to create your universe, understand your obligations, put it in terms that your management and staff can understand. Create a framework that caters for inconsistency and oversight and sanction. I advise not to take a chance, and be aware of the consumer. Get informed and stay informed. So it's time for the sales pitch. Compliance salesmen are like the mafia. That's a nice business you've got there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. This is LexisNexis's game. Let us help you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Thanks for taking us through that. I don't see any questions, so I think you were pretty clear in going through the regulatory pitch. Maybe just from my side, a take out of this is that being non-compliant or ignorant ignorance is not an excuse. I mean, if the regulators are not enforcing, it doesn't mean that we should go haywire and not, and be non-compliant, because nobody's compliant. There will just be that day where everything clamps down on you. But yeah, thank you for this. I'm just going to give it another minute to see if there's any questions popping up. At this point in time, nothing.
I think you're right there, Bosman. And when we look at the market, as you know, I think one of the key challenges we find is in the, not so much at the top end on the huge organizations, the Cecils and the first tier banks, etc. But in a medium and small organizations is when they can get to the point of understanding how important compliance is. But it's a daunting task. Where do you start? When people like me now talk about 50 pieces of legislation, it just scares, it's daunting.
Yeah.
So it's important to not have compliance in mind as your goal for the year, perhaps, but rather to have a journey and understand that you're not going to reach compliance or even compliance management and compliance understanding of obligations in a year, but you need to start the journey. So understand, we've really got people running around and making sure you got posters in your warehouse floor and, abiding by the rules of COVID with hand sanitizers, etc. But set yourself small goals to say, okay, let me, make sure I document in a reasonable level of detail, let's say the top 10 pieces of legislation, and go through a journey and do it bit by bit. It's not something you can just hit on the head and get it done with.
Yeah. So yes, 100%. What I do find a lot of times, and even out of my previous consulting years, is that it sometimes becomes a bit of a balancing act with organizations. And as you say, especially in medium-sized organizations where there's not a lot of, cash and expenses are monitored quite closely, that when it comes to resources that, and especially when it comes to the compliance parts and the enforcement is not that great, that those parts are normally, or a lot of times, neglected. And through that neglect, they're going backwards and then suddenly, get hit with hefty fines out of the blue. And I think a lot of these organizations that we've seen, even from the times of, what was that organization in the States, but irrespective, that you then suddenly get hit and to the extent that you either need to pay heavy penalties and even close down, and the law is still there. The regulations and what you need to be compliant to is still there. That doesn't change. It's just a matter of making sure that you're compliant. And as you said, you can't be compliant to everything 100% all at once, but you need to be able to show that you are working towards full compliance, and obviously resource spent, etc., and effort will normally determine how quickly you get to that point where you are compliant to the extent that you don't suffer these major consequences.
Yeah, I think you probably find that compliance and the enforcement of compliance in South Africa really started with OH&S, the health and safety, occupational health and safety stuff and the environment. But it wasn't a function that was easily outsourced. There are many service providers that can assist you in that area and that will help you do the audits and put in your control measures and advise you of your control measures, etc. The other areas of compliance, probably the next one that is well supported is in the human resources environment. But beyond that, you're basically left to your own resources. And because the key start in the compliance, you were able to outsource almost everything. We haven't developed inside our organizations methodologies to create compliance environments, how to manage compliance. We just outsourced it in the past. So yeah, that's another challenge that our customers are facing, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thanks for all that information and your insights. And yes, as I said, if you don't want to pose questions here and you do want to speak to us afterwards, please feel free to contact us. I see the polls have been running for a little while. If you can maybe answer those to the best of your ability. But thank you, Greg. It's a hot topic, and I think one can talk about this for hours, and we can even look at maybe a panel discussion for future webinars on this topic, because it is a very key topic, and a lot of companies are suffering because of not necessarily always understanding. And I'm not talking about, you would sometimes have the compliance officer or the safety officer or the risk manager addressing issues and taking it to the board, but the board still makes their decisions, or the executive committees. And a lot of times the ignorance or the lack of information or understanding sits there. So yes, we can still take this a long way. And but thank you for today. We only had so many minutes, and for taking us through that. If we can, just as a final note, say, and you have already said it, evaluate your situation, start small and build it up to the point of complete compliance. I believe you can never be 100% compliant, although you can strive for that. But you can get very close, and yeah, just start small and build it up and take one piece at a time and ensure. But we are there to help. We also have tools and solutions to assist with that, and that's now my little sales pitch there. Not really that I'm a salesperson, but yeah, thank you for today. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. I think we still got everybody that joined right in the beginning is still with us, so thank you for that. Yeah, in these uncertain times, as I said right in the beginning, stay safe, ensure compliance, and make sure that you've got your risks identified and mitigated and put your necessary control measures in place. And yeah, what we have experienced is that our compliance and risk managers fulfill a much bigger task or job at the exco level or at the board level these days than maybe in prior years. Good luck, look after yourselves, and we would like to see you again towards the end of February. That'll be our next webinar, maybe just in the beginning of March, because February is quite a short month, but we hope to see you then again. Thank you very much, and goodbye.